All right, well, thank you, everybody, for coming here. It's great to have you this evening. I am Nathan Fox. I'm chair of the MFA Visual Narrative Program here at SVA. We are easily a low residency interdisciplinary graduate program in visual storytelling as both writer and artist. And it's great to have Lisa here today. This is a continuation of our Storyteller series, so thank you guys for coming. And the one thing that I guess I would like to start out with maybe is a little house cleaning for those that are here and are interested in some of the other events we have. Coming up, we have a free risograph workshop on December 1st, and all of our artists in residence on December 15th will be presenting their work in the Riso Lab. And also on December 3rd and 4th, we have Building Interactive Worlds Across Media, a workshop, a gaming workshop by Matthew Weiss. If anybody's interested in any of those, please see Joan McCabe, our Director of Operations, and myself afterwards. Be happy to give you a bit more information on those. I am thrilled to have Lisa Cron here this evening as well as faculty. We met a couple of years ago and struck it off quite well. Some amazing critiques on storytelling and what story is. So it was quite a benefit and quite a treat to have her here tonight for you guys as well. Lisa Cron is the author of Wired for Story and Story Genius. Her video tutorial, Writing Fundamentals, The Craft of Story, can be found at lynda.com, and her TEDx talk, Wired for Story, opened Furman University 2014 TEDx Conference, Stories, the Common Thread of Our Humanity. So Lisa has worked in publishing at W.W. Norton as an agent at the Angela Rinaldi Literary Agency, as a producer on shows for Showtime and Court TV, and as a story consultant for Warner Brothers and William Morris Agency. Since 2006, she's been an instructor at the UCLA Extension Writers Program, and she is currently on our faculty at the MFA Visual Narrative Program here at the School of Visual Arts. Lisa helps writers, nonprofits, educators, and journalists wrangle their stories and how to tell them on the page. She can be reached at wiredforstory.com. After the talk and the Q&As, her 2 books will be available for sale, so please stay tuned for that. And now the storytelling genius herself, Lisa Cron.
No pressure, right? So hi, you guys. I just want to say really how fabulous it is to be here, because there is nothing that I love more than being in a room full of storytellers, in a room full of writers. Because writers, you guys, you are the most powerful people on the planet. Why? Because story is the most powerful communication tool in the world. You have the ability to change how your reader sees the world, sees themselves, what they go out and do in the world, simply by giving them a glimpse of life, letting them experience life through your protagonist's skin as she navigates that tough story problem that you've set out for her. And that is an incredible amount of power. In fact, I would say that it's more power than you know you have, and hopefully by the end of tonight, you'll be more tapped into, wow, I do have a lot of power. But there's just one caveat, and that is that you have to have actually told a story. And that's my topic. My topic is always story. It's never writing per se, but it's story itself. And you might think, well, wait a minute, didn't you write that book like Wired for Story? Like, we are wired for story, so why do we even need to talk about that? And the answer is, as the great Southern writer Flannery O'Connor once quipped, she said, I find that most people know what a story is, because we're wired for it, until they sit down to write one. And I can't tell you how true that is. I have spent my career working with story and working with writers for more decades than I actually want to admit to being alive. And I can't tell you in that time how many manuscripts I've read where if you asked me, what's it about, I'd say, it's about 300 pages. I have no idea. It's just a bunch of things that happen. And so the question is, Why is that true? Why is that true if we're wired for story? And especially these days, so many of us want to write stories and tell stories. Why is it so hard? And I think the answer is because everything you know about writing is wrong. And I know that is a deeply incendiary, bold statement to make. So let's think about it. Let's parse it out a little bit. So when you decided that you wanted to write, when you thought about becoming a storyteller, what was the first thing that people said to you? And it just seemed logical. If you want to be a successful writer, you need to learn to write well. And that makes total and complete sense. I mean, I'm not here to tell you that is like total BS and really what you need to do is learn to write poorly. That is how you get successful. I'm not going to say that. But let's parse it out a little bit further. When people think of writing well, when you're taught to write well, what does that usually taken to mean? It's taken to mean that what you're going to do is you're going to come up with interesting premises, you're going to come up with really interesting conflicted characters, you're going to learn to write really good scenes, you're going to write great dialogue that sounds authentic, you're going to learn to write lovely, luscious sentences, beautiful metaphors. Then you're going to sprinkle in a lot of sensory details because that's what we're told brings a story to life. And once you've learned all of those separate elements, and you can do all of that well, what you're going to do is you're going to unleash your creativity, and somehow, by magic, a story is going to appear. And that is not how it works. All of those elements, all of that writing is the handmaiden of story, not the other way around. It is the story that gives those words their power. Because there is only one thing that a story absolutely, positively has to do. And that is, it has to grab your reader, grab your audience from the very first sentence, from the very first image, and make them, as we'll discuss biologically, have to know what happens next. Got that sense of urgency. Everything else is gravy. Now, I'm not saying that learning to write well isn't a good idea. Of course it is. But beautifully written, storyless novels are what's known in the trade as a perfectly penned who cares. Beautifully written, storyless novels, storyless movies are about as engaging as a perfectly rendered bowl of waxed fruit, and about as moving as a totally tricked out car with no engine. It just sits there. I mean, ask yourselves, if beautiful writing and learning to write well is really what grabs us, if that's what our brain is really hungry for, and that's what brings readers in, now what I used to say at this moment is, would the Da Vinci Code really be the 8th best-selling novel of all time? I don't say that anymore, and I'm sure it's no longer true. What I say now, and I'm glad you're sitting down, is, would the 50 Shades of Grey trilogy really have sold 100 million copies and counting? 100 million copies. That is a lot of copies. To put it into context, that would be everyone who voted in this past election. That is 100 million people. And what does everybody say about those books? They say, really poorly written by good writing standards, but couldn't, even if only 50 million people read it, couldn't put it down. That is a lot of people. And I'll tell you, I actually read 50 Shades of Grey. I post once a month on a really great writing site called The Writer Unboxed. And there's another writer there, a guy named Donald Moss, who you may have heard of. He's an agent here in New York. He's written several books on writing. I think his most famous is writing your breakout novel. And we got together one month and we said, let's write something. It'll be like 50 things that writers can learn from 50 Shades of Grey. And I think we stopped at about 70-something just because it was like, we had to pull the plug at some point. And so I can tell you it's really poorly written. I did one of those, Amazon searches that you can do so you can see how many times a phrase is used in a book. The intrepid heroine, Anastasia Steele, says, holy crap, 40 times in the first novel alone. 40 times. Holy crap is an expression you used to say one time in your whole entire life. If you already said it, even like in the second grade, you've used your quota. You're done. She says, inner goddess, So many times, if you used it for a drinking game, you'd be in rehab before you were halfway through the book. It really is poorly written. And yet, 100 million people, 100 million. So there's two ways to look at that. One would be to go, okay, those are 100 million really stupid people, and I don't care about them. I'm not writing for them. I'm writing for everyone. Who does that even leave? I don't know. So the other question is okay, so maybe there is something else. Maybe it's good writing isn't the thing that we're pulled into. Maybe that's not what we're wired for. But the question is, then why do we think it is? Why do we believe that? And there's two answers to that question. The first has to do with how we're wired. Because the first job of a good story is to anesthetize the part of your brain that knows it is a story. When you're lost in that reality, that layered reality, and as we'll talk about, your biology has literally put you on timeout, and you're in that world. The last thing you can do, or want to do for that matter, is to figure out how the writer has created that sense of reality that you are actually living in. But when you're in that state, and we've all been in that state, you say, okay, I'm reading a book, I'll read one more page, and then one more page, and then one more chapter, and then the sun's coming up, and you're exhausted because you forgot what even tired felt like. You were just in that world of the story. When you're there are two things that you still can see. There are two things, and that's because we think concretely, we think in images. The first thing that you can see are the words, right? So you've read the words, and how many times have you read a book where you've said, oh my gosh, I love this writer. She's so funny, she's so wry, she's so insightful. I would read anything that she's written. And then you read a review of the book, and the reviewer has plucked out some lovely, luscious sentence, maybe a great metaphor. And you think, oh my gosh, I want to be a writer because I want to learn to write sentences like that. As opposed to, I want to learn to write the kind of story that would give sentences like that their power. The other thing that you can see when you're reading is the plot. You can see what happens. You see it in your mind's eye. If you're watching a movie, you see the scenes. So it's very easy to therefore assume that, okay, if you want to write a story, here's what you need to do. Come up with a plot, and then learn to write beautiful sentences, and voila, you'll have a story. And as we'll see, it absolutely does not work that way, because that is not what's captivating us. The other thing, the other reason why we tend to think that it's about beautiful writing has a lot to do with the way that writing is taught. From kindergarten on up, we're not going to talk about kindergarten right now, but especially when you decide to be a writer, the way it's taught, present company included, not this school because it's visual narrative, but in those literary MFA programs. Because they tend to be taught in all of the books by famous writers talking about how they write, they tend to be taught by writers who have a natural sense of story. I am not talking about talent. I don't think that they have talent. What they have in, as we'll discuss later, their cognitive unconscious, is they can see the layers of story at a clip, and most people cannot. They have a natural sense of story the way some people have perfect pitch. They could write a laundry list, and you would be sobbing over the plight of poorly sorted socks. They just have that thing. But because they were born with it, they've never had to deconstruct it. They don't know what it is. They have no idea what's pulling people in. They actually think that if you sit down and you learn all these elements and you learn to write these beautiful sentences, that somehow a story actually is going to appear. Because as cognitive psychologists will tell you, it's nigh on impossible to teach something that you did not have to learn yourself. It would be sort of like if someone came up to you and said, I've never walked before. Like, can you give me some pointers on walking? And you'd go, of course, I walk all the time. I happen to be I walked here, as a matter of fact. Here, watch. And then you'd glide across the room, and you try to be very graceful because you wanted to show them what a good walker you were. And you turn around just in time to catch them, rolling their eyes. And they'd go, yeah, okay, I'm not blind. I see that. But how are you doing it? How are you walking? And you'd go, I just do it. I don't know. My brain says walk, and I walk. And the truth is, when you think about it, your brain doesn't say walk and you walk. What you really do is you think, I'm hungry, I want a snack, and somehow your legs are taking you to the kitchen without you ever telling them what to do. Usually you want to tell them not to because you shouldn't have had that snack. But the point is, we have no idea what we do to walk. Do you know what muscles you move, what electrical impulse? Of course you don't, because it's muscle memory. And I think it's for the same reason that they say that the best athletes make the worst coaches. So the question is, if it's not about beautiful writing, and if we are wired for story, what does that mean exactly? What does even wired for story mean? What are you even talking about? So what I want to talk to you about now are, I'm so bad with numbers, 5 things, I believe. Let's see if I've got 5. 5. I want to talk to you about how story and the brain evolved in tandem, and then the fact as to why we use story and not facts to make sense of everything. Then we'll talk about what it is that gives story its unparalleled power. Then we're going to talk about, okay, for our purposes, if you want to actually write a story, what actually is a story? What is a story? What is it that's hooked us? How do we get that onto the page? And then we'll run through, this is 5, this is good. We will run through a very familiar story, one that I think that you probably will know, and if you don't, I think I tell it well enough that you'll know it by the end. So there are a couple of things that I'm going to say that might change how you look at story, might change how you look at everything, but there's one thing that I think we can all agree on out of the starting gate, and that is that we all love story. We've all loved stories. We wouldn't be here if we didn't love story. We've loved stories since we're 3 years old. In fact, there's never been a society on earth that didn't have storytelling. It's a human universal, which probably should have clued us into the fact that there's a bit more to it than just like a great way to spend a Saturday night. So the question is, why don't we know that? Why don't we know about story's power? And the great irony is that the reason we don't know how powerful story is precisely because we love it so much. And because we love it so much, we marginalize it. And we think of it as it's like the town I live in. When I was a little kid, I loved saying, I'm growing up in the entertainment capital of the world. The entertainment industry. We think of stories as entertainment. And it's like, I'm sure you've all had this experience. You come home after a hard day at work or a hard day at school. You've done real things in the real world. And what do after you have the snack? You turn on the TV, you pick up a novel, you start watching some show on your phone that's like you're streaming from Amazon, because you want to reward yourself for a job well done in the real world and lose yourself in the world of make-believe. You want to recharge your batteries and kick back and take time out and just enjoy yourself. And as a result, we have made stories optional. It's very easy to think, I know that our lives would be far drabber without stories, but we'd have survived just fine because it's not like stories serve some actual purpose or anything, other than having a great time. And that couldn't be further from the truth. Story is how we got here. Story was more crucial to our evolution than our much touted, and genuinely beloved opposable thumbs. Because all opposable thumbs do is let us hang on. It is story that tells us what to hang on to. Just think of story as the world's first virtual reality minus that super geeky visor. Because without story, all we'd have is the perpetual right now. And I don't care what Eckhart Tolle or Tolle or however you say his name, I don't care what he says. Being in the present all the time is not a good idea. Because if we were always in the present, we wouldn't even know that there was a tomorrow, let alone be able to anticipate and plan for the dangers and delights that might wait for us there. Story is what allowed us to step out of the present so we could envision the future and plan for the thing that from time immemorial till now scares us more than anything. And that is the unknown and the unexpected. Because ask yourself, how often is what you expect to have happen what actually happens? Hardly ever. And when it does, how often does it feel the way that you thought it would? Again, hardly ever. Stories are simulations that allow us from the safety of our own armchair to envision difficult situations we haven't yet had to face, both good and bad, because good change is just as difficult and challenging as bad change. It's just as hard to leave home to get married as it is to get divorced. So from that, our own armchair, we can try that out and see what would that feel like? And what would I need to learn in order to survive? Like, I see those red berries over there and they look delicious and I am starving. And did I mention it's the Stone Age, so I can't, go to the 7-Eleven, buy a frozen burrito, take it home and nuke it? But I heard this story about the Neanderthal next door who chowed down on a couple of buckets of those berries, and the way they said she was foaming at the mouth and writhing on the ground before she died. I mean, she died, so that should be enough, but it also sounded really painful. So I think I'll forego those berries and make do with a couple of cold, stale beetles and live to see the dawn. In other words, the story was so crucial. It was so seminal to our survival that nature, our biology, saw to it that it was enjoyable, so we'd pay attention and not eat the red berries. Stories are enjoyable. They feel good for the same reason that food tastes good and sex feels good. Because without them, we couldn't survive. And that great feeling you get when you're lost in a story, it's not arbitrary, it's not ephemeral, it's not pleasure for pleasure's sake, it's not love of language, it isn't even the point. It's actually the biological lure, the hook that paralyzes us so that we can leave the real world behind and experience the world of the story. Do you know what it actually is? What that actually is that causes that great feeling? It's a surge of the neurotransmitter dopamine that's triggered by the intense curiosity that an effective story will always immediately engender. It's your brain's way of urging you to follow that curiosity to find out how the story ends, because you just might learn something that you need to know. Because we come to every story asking one question in what's known as our cognitive unconscious. And like one quick timeout, cognitive unconscious. Okay, what is that exactly? We have very big brains, but most of our decisions, and this is really the scary part when you start like reading the neuroscience, is you realize how little control we actually have. Most of the decisions we make in life are made in what's known as our cognitive unconscious. It's 90-some%. Thinking part of the brain is much smaller. In fact, they say that studies have shown that we make, I think it's 35,000 decisions a day. Can you believe that? 35,000 decisions a day. And of those, we're consciously aware of maybe like 70 of them. And let's face it, most of them are like, should I wear the red socks or should I wear the green socks? Like, not important decisions. So most decisions are made in your cognitive unconscious. That leaves the thinking part of your brain, which is very, very slow and uses a lot of energy for those situations when you don't automatically know what to do, because it takes a lot of energy to think. I mean, what do they say? That I think our brain is something like 2% of our body weight and it uses 20% of our energy. I mean, thinking really hard actually burns calories. Not enough calories, clearly, but it burns calories. And so this is for those things where we don't know what to do, and it is super slow. Let me give you an example of what would happen if this part of our brain had to make sense of the things that our cognitive unconscious makes sense of. And this is, imagine, and I'm sure this has happened to most of us, you're driving, and ahead you see a sea of red. Now, if this part of your brain had to figure out what to do, it would go, look at that sea of red up there. I think those are taillights. That means those cars are going slow. No, wait. Upon further inspection, I think they're at a dead stop, and I'm going pretty fast. So I bet, now at that point, you would be embedded in the back seat of the car in front of you. But that's not how it works. And watch next time, if you have the feeling that your foot is reaching for the brake before your conscious mind has any idea why, that's your cognitive unconscious. It's your cognitive unconscious, really quick example, that when you're texting knows where the letters are. Can you imagine if you had to figure that out? I mean, we'd never get anywhere that way. So we come to every story that we hear. And when I say every story, I'm not just talking about novels or movies or what we binge watch on Netflix. I'm talking about every story that we hear, whether it's around the water cooler, or, somebody calling up and telling you about what happened at work or their weird blind date. We come to every story asking one question. What am I going to learn here that's going to help me make it through the night? What am I going to learn that's going to help me navigate the physical world? And just as important, in fact, these days, more importantly, the social world. Because, another quick timeout, because about 150, 200,000 years ago, our brain had, you might have heard, its last big growth spurt. And it was at that point that we've been told, and kind of what they thought for a very long time, is that the reason for that growth spurt was because that we needed to learn to think analytically, right? That's when critical thought, was wired into our brain. But evolutionary biologists now believe that that isn't really why that change took place. The reason why it took place was because at that point, we had, in a very rudimentary way, we had figured out how to master the physical world. We weren't going to eat the red berries. If we were walking and we saw a cliff, we knew better than to keep going, or else we would splat to the bottom. If a lion was coming at us, we knew we better, run, or else we were going to end up as lunch. And at that point, our biology, nature, realized that if we were going to do what we've since done for better or for worse, which is take over the world, we were going to have to learn to do that thing that we've all been taught to do since kindergarten, and that is we needed to learn how to work well with others. And at that moment, our need to belong to a group became as hardwired as our need for food, air, and water. And stories became about how to interact in the social world, because there are no lone wolves out there. There aren't even lone wolves in the wolf community. We are all people who need people. And the takeaway is, we don't turn to story to escape reality. We turn to story to navigate reality. Because story takes big ideas, dry concepts, abstract facts, and it turns them into something very, very specific so we can figure out how they would affect us, which brings us to our second point, which is that we use story and not facts to make sense of everything. And you might be thinking, okay, wait a minute, I get your point about story dramatizing the facts, but when we want to make sense of things, don't we use facts? It's like, facts, what even are facts? Do we even have facts anymore? Don't we use facts? And the answer is, actually, no, we don't. One of two things happens when we get facts. The first thing that happens when someone is giving you facts, and now these are facts that just fly right over your head because you cannot see how they would ever relate to you. You have no context within to fit them. They're just like roaming facts. Over they go. It is very hard to make this part of your brain pay the slightest bit of attention to them. It would be like, experience that we, I think, all had back in high school or junior high, when your teacher wants you to memorize a succession of German monarchs starting in 800 going on up, or learn how to multiply by fractions, and you're thinking, why do I ever need to know this? I'm not going on Jeopardy. I'm never going to use this. And even when you try to pay attention and you try to focus on things where you can never see how they're going to be relevant to you at all, what ends up happening is you're thinking and you're focusing, and then you discover what you're really thinking is, I'm hungry. I wonder how much longer till lunch. In other words, this part of your brain is focused on the things that actually matter and have an effect. The second thing that happens when we get facts, and now these are facts that are meant to change us, meant to perhaps enlarge our worldview, maybe even challenge something we already believe. When that happens, up comes our analytic brain, and its goal is to poke holes in everything that challenges what we already believe, even if it's challenging our brand of toothpaste. Because once we believe something, it becomes part of how we see ourselves. It becomes part of our self-identity. And so to challenge that is to challenge us. There's a term in biology. It's called homeostasis. And what homeostasis means is that any creature, from an amoeba to a yellow-bellied sapsucker, to us and beyond, once we're in a particular environment where we have enough food, we have enough water, the temperature is right, we know how to survive, we're in balance. It's not just that we want to stay in balance, it's that we want to stay in that particular balance. That becomes our comfort zone. And the irony when we think of comfort zones is we take that word comfortable and it sounds like it's our comfort zone. It means we like it, it's fun, it's great. Most people don't even like their comfort zone. It's why we stick with the devil we know, because it's familiar. There might be a cute devil out there, but to actually go out and see, we'd have to come out of this comfort zone. And that's terrifying. That's why stories are about what happens when we get pushed out of our comfort zone. Because otherwise, we are just going to argue. And I want to give you an example, and this is just a kind of a short a short kind of shift in what I usually say, because I started I started giving this talk a little over 4 years ago during the last election. And so I kind of wanted to take that and kind of adapt it to what's going on now. And I realized I couldn't, because I would say, we're in this election cycle, and it's so contentious, and it's the country is so divided. And when we think back 4 years ago, that seems so genteel. That doesn't seem divided compared to now. So I'm going to go back to then. I'm going to say, remember 4 years ago. Remember the election 4 years ago, and the world felt very divided back then. And I'm sure whoever you were for 4 years ago, you thought that person was great, and you thought the other guy was a complete and total moron. I know that's certainly what I thought. So what happened back 4 years ago when, your Aunt Millie sat you down and started to tell you why the other guy was perfect and right about everything? I mean, did you listen and nod and take it in and weigh what she was saying? Of course not. Who would do that? You waited for her to stop talking so you could tell her why everything she just said was wrong and why what you believe is right. But here's the thing. When you're talking to her, she's doing the exact same thing to you, so you never get anywhere that way. Story, on the other hand, anesthetizes that part of the brain. Watch, I'm not talking about just like little kids sitting on a rug, but watch with adults. If you say, no, listen, let me tell you a story. Body language changes. People lean in, their shoulders go down. It's amazing. And what's happening is up's coming the dopamine, and it's saying to that analytic brain, shh, shut up, don't talk. This is going to feel good. I'm going to get lucky. Please be quiet. Don't talk. Let me enjoy this. I want to get lost in the world of the story. And when I say get lost in the world of the story, I am not talking metaphorically. I'm talking literally. They've done functional MRI studies that show when you're lost in a story, same areas of your brain light up that would light up if you were doing what that main character is doing. You really are there. You're not reading about Jane Eyre. You are Jane Eyre. And I'm sure you've seen the studies that have shown that reading and that going deeply into story actually can rewire our brain to have more empathy. It's like otherwise you might look at some group of people who are very different than you and go, oh my God, look at those idiots. I can't believe they're doing that. I can't believe that is how they are handling that situation. If that was me, thank you, Joan. I needed that too. If that was me, I would do it very differently. And P.S. obviously much better. And then you read a story and you are in their skin, and the things that have happened to them in their lives have happened to you. And you think, whoa, this feels very different than I thought it would. I didn't realize that. In fact, we're more alike than I thought we were. And your behavior changes. Let me give you an example. There was a study that was done in 2010 in Ohio State University, and it was in part to see what would have a greater effect on college-age women's use of birth control. Would it be a new-style documentary about the horrors of teen pregnancy, or would it be an episode of a very popular nighttime teen soap? So one group of women watched this documentary that they produced, and it was good. It had high production values. It had all sorts of really scary facts and really scary figures and all these horrible things that were going to happen to you from when you found out you were pregnant until you died, and like you died sooner. It had teen moms and dads talking about how their lives had been completely upended once they became parents. The other group watched an episode of the nighttime teen soap, The O.C., in which two of the main characters, Ryan and Teresa, they were high school seniors, were dealing with the gut-wrenching, heartbreaking consequences of an unintended pregnancy. No facts, no figures, no data, just that moment when Teresa wakes up and her whole life does a flip-flop. Now, I know you know where this is going. The women who watched the documentary, up came that analytic brain, and they went, yeah, That doesn't apply to me. None of that would ever happen. What I'm doing is it's working so far. In fact, look what's happening to those idiots. In fact, if anything, and I'm sure this is a term that we've heard a lot lately, confirmation bias, I'm sure a lot of it, they weren't even hearing any of that. And their behavior stayed the same. Women who watch the TV show, because they had viscerally experienced what Teresa went through in virtual reality, last thing they wanted to do was go through that in their own reality, and their behavior changed. Now think about that for a minute, because what was the reason for that documentary? What was its agenda? It had one agenda, it had one reason for being, one reason to act, if I've pronounced that correctly, I don't speak French, one reason, and that was to change behavior. And it didn't. What was the goal of the TV show, besides ratings and, to sell whatever the advertisers were selling? To entertain. Just wanted to entertain. And that changed behavior, because there's an expression that's bandied about all the time, and this is why storytellers can, I think, often be irresponsible on one level. It doesn't matter. It's just mindless entertainment. There is no such thing as mindless entertainment. We are affected by stories every minute of every day, whether we know it or not, and usually we do not know it. I like to redefine a lot of terms, and mindless entertainment is one that I've always liked to redefine. Here's my definition of mindless entertainment. Entertainment, stories, enters through our gut. We feel what those characters feel. We feel why they feel it. It changes how we see the world, and now the world looks different and we see things differently. But it never goes through this thinking part of our brain. So if you want to think of mindless entertainment that way, absolutely, positively. And the reason that story has that power, which is going to bring us to our third point, is that story translates all of those big generalities and conceptions and ideas and themes and channels them into something very, very, very specific that makes them accessible to the one biological system by which we make every decision we ever make. And this might change how you see everything. And that is our emotion. And I know that flies in the face of what all of us have probably been taught. It certainly flies in the face of what I was taught. I was taught, you probably heard this too, that when you want to make a decision, a big decision, but really like it works for any decision, you want to marshal all the facts, all the figures, all the data, so you can analyze it dispassionately in the cold light of objective reason. And when you do that, there's always like one caveat, one thing that they tell you. They say when you do that, you want to be sure that you keep emotion at bay, because emotion is an irascible scamp, and it's going to tiptoe in and cloud your judgment. You'll make a bad decision you're going to regret in the morning. And that's a great model, isn't it? It makes you feel so safe. It makes you feel so secure. How many times have you been told that it is your ability to think rationally that makes you the master of your own ship? It's a great model. It just isn't true. We don't make decisions based on our rational analysis of the situation. We make decisions based on how that rational analysis makes us feel. Now, a couple of qualifiers. When I say emotion, I am not talking about emotional. Emotional is a very narrow band or pitch of emotion that sometimes does get people carried away. Often it's used just to mean, emotion that we can see, which is a shame. So yes, sometimes being emotional can lead you the wrong way. I'm not talking about being emotional. I'm talking about emotion. Neither am I talking about just big box emotions. Happy, sad, jealousy, hatred. Emotion is much more subtle than that. Those are just big box emotions. The kind of emotions I'm talking about, I don't think they're ineffable. I think we just don't have the language for it yet. Because emotion comes from feeling. And you might think, okay, wait a minute, emotion, feeling, aren't those like synonymous? And the answer is no. Feeling is a chemical reaction. There is nothing in your life that you ever experience, think about, go through, that does not bring with it a wave of feeling, which is a chemical reaction that your brilliant brain and nervous system then immediately translates into emotion that lets you know what you feel about it and therefore guides you to what you might do. But that does not mean that you're going to necessarily do the first thing that you feel like doing. Like, for instance, I might feel like eating an entire chocolate cake at midnight. Am I going to do that? I hope not. I don't want to do that. So I'm going to think about it, and I'm going to think, I've really been trying to eat healthy lately, and I've been real good all day, and eating a chocolate cake at midnight is not going to go over well, not a good idea. And plus, I baked that cake for my daughter's birthday tomorrow, and if she wakes up and there's an empty plate in the sink, definitely not going to be happy. So I guess I won't eat the cake. Why? Because if I ate it, it would make me feel bad. As a matter of fact, if you couldn't feel emotion, you couldn't make a single rational decision. Let me give you an example. There's a neuroscientist out of LA, I think he's still at USC. His name is Antonio Damasio, and he frequently writes about a patient he had, a man by the name of Elliot. And Elliot was one of those really successful guys. He had a great job, he had a great family, but he also had a benign brain tumor. Now, it was successfully removed, but to get it, they had to take some of his prefrontal cortex. And after that, his life started to fall apart. He was in the process of losing his job and his family when he found Damasio, and he said, can you help me? I'm not me anymore. What do I do? And Damasio said, okay. They ran a battery of tests, and what he discovered is that Elliot had lost the ability to feel emotion. Now, keep in mind, he's still tested in the 97th percentile in intelligence. And he could enumerate he could enumerate tons of solutions to any problem that you could pitch at him. He just couldn't pick one. He would go into his office in the morning and go, yikes, I hope I didn't break something. I don't know my own strength. He would go into his office in the morning and think, should I do that thing my boss keeps asking me to do? Or should I alphabetize my file folders again today? And if I do, is it the blue pen or is it the black pen? At lunch, he'd go from restaurant to restaurant looking at menus, but he never went in because he didn't know what he felt like eating. Can you imagine that in your life? If you never felt anything about anything, if it really was 6 of one, half a dozen of the other. The amazing thing about emotion to me is that on the one hand, we're terrified of it. But on the other hand, what scares us more than anything is, and think about it, when those horrible shootings happen and you see those pictures of those guys and you think, oh my gosh, look at him. He's got dead eyes. Or in horror movies, oh my God, look, that guy's coming at you, and his face is emotionless. It's why they say AI isn't going to work, because it can't feel. Emotion is at the base of everything. As Harvard psychology professor Daniel Gilbert says in his brilliant book, Stumbling on Happiness, indeed, feelings don't just matter. Feelings are what mattering means. And the takeaway is, emotion isn't the monkey wrench in the system. Emotion is the system. If we're not feeling, we can't make a single rational decision. And in a story, if we're not feeling what the protagonist is feeling in the moment, on the page, explicitly, we are not reading or watching. So the question is, okay, what's a story? What is a story? What are we talking about? What exactly is a story? So, and this is long form. This is for those of you who may actually want to write a story, a screenplay, whatever. What is a story exactly? So I'm going to say it twice, slowly, and then we'll break it down in familiar writing parlance. What actually is a story? A story is about how what happens affects someone in pursuit of a deceptively difficult goal, and how that person changes internally as a result. You say that again. Story is about how what happens affects someone in pursuit of a deceptively difficult goal, and how that person changes internally as a result. Now let's break that down in familiar writing parlance. A story is about how what happens. That what happens is the surface of your story. It is just the surface of your story. It is in no way the most important part of the story. Yes, that is the plot. And a story is not about the plot. And I know this is like a super incendiary thing to say, like literally and figuratively, and I'm going to say it anyway. If it was up to me, I would burn every copy of The Hero's Journey and every story structure book out there because they lead writers astray. Because first of all, it's a misnomer. It's not story structure, it's plot structure, which is very, very, very different and not at all what you want to look at first. It's just the surface. So a story is about how what happens, that's the plot, affects someone. That is the protagonist. That is whose skin your reader, your viewer is in throughout the story. And everything that happens over there in that plot is going to get its meaning and emotional weight based on one thing and one thing only, and that is how it is affecting your protagonist. This is what readers come for. I often think of it as a story. It's like a Vulcan mind meld between, your protagonist and your audience or your reader. That is where story lies, that brain, the way your protagonist is experiencing what's happening, is making sense of what's happening, is the command center of any story. So it's how what happens, that's the plot, is affecting the protagonist and not affecting them in general. Like your protagonist, doesn't want to die. Like I would make a bet that none of us in this room right now really want to die, like ever, But so it wouldn't be like the protagonist doesn't want to die, and over here in the plot, people are getting shot at. It's not general like that. It's how what happens affects someone in pursuit of a deceptively difficult goal. How is this affecting them getting that goal? And that goal is what's known as the story problem. Sometimes it's the plot problem. It is both internal and external. It is something hard. It's a problem, which means that protagonists are always struggling. They're always struggling. If you have a story where the protagonist is having a great time going from party to party, or difficult things happen and they can just, without breaking a sweat, they can solve it, that is not a story. So it's about how what happens, that's the plot, affects someone, that's the protagonist, in pursuit of a deceptively difficult goal, that is that plot problem, and how that person, the protagonist, changes internally as a result. And that, my friends, that internal change is what a story is actually about. In other words, the story is not about the plot. The story is about how the plot affects the protagonist. Story is not about an internal change. Story is not about an external change. Story is about an internal change. And if you're thinking, well, wait a minute. So I've got this plot. What do you mean it makes the protagonist change? Change from what to what? What do you mean? Aha. All protagonists enter the story with two things already fully formed and created and developed, because all stories begin en medias res. En medias res is Latin for in the middle of the thing. Not just the first scene that begins en medias res, but all stories begin en medias res. If this is the middle, right here is page 1, and right over here is where the story starts. And it starts with, again, I'm going to pull this over here for 1 second. If this is the beginning, this is page 1. Before we get to page 1, protagonist already has something they want and have wanted for a very long time. This is what creates their agenda. And they have a misbelief. They have something that also is very long-standing and that has kept them from getting what they want. And those two things, the misbelief, which we'll talk about in a sec, and what they want, have caromed through their life until the plot forces them to go after what they want. But in order to get that, they've got to overcome this misbelief, or not, depending on what's going to happen. Now, you might think, wait, misbelief. I think I've heard of that before. That sounds, vaguely familiar. Are you talking about a fatal flaw? We've all heard that. Protagonists enter with a fatal flaw or a wound, and the story is about how they have to overcome that fatal flaw. And that is not a term that I would use anymore. Reason being is when you think of fatal flaw, just think of how that sounds. Fatal flaw. Doesn't that sound really judgmental? Doesn't that sound really finger waggy? Doesn't that sound almost like they're morally weak, like they're doing it on purpose, like you might say to your significant other when things have gone wrong, and you go, and they go, what? And you go, you know what you did. It's as if they know they're doing it, and now you're going to create a plot that hopefully will teach them their lesson, and maybe they'll, reform, maybe not, we'll see. Wound goes in the exact opposite direction, so that it's like, oh, poor protagonist, now they're a victim. And they've been hurt by life, and hopefully, over the course of the plot, they'll heal, and then they'll be okay at the end. Now, I'm not saying that both of those things in a particular story not be so, but I don't think that that's what we're talking about. What we're actually talking about, and what stories are about, are how we overcome misbeliefs. And we all have them, defining misbelief. And a misbelief is something that comes in very early in life, as when you're a child, or a teenager. It's when we're trying to make sense of the world and we're going through something that is traumatic. And when I say traumatic, I mean more emotionally traumatic than, someone has a gun to your head or they put you in a suitcase or something. Something has happened, and in order to emotionally survive that situation, character has a small aha moment about how the world works, about what things mean. And in that situation, it was true. It was adaptive. Problem is, the minute they leave that situation, it's now maladaptive. But they don't know that. As far as they're concerned, it is a very hard-won, closely held piece of inside intel about how the world works. They believe it. They don't think it's a misbelief. They think it's 100% true. For instance, it might be something like, and very quickly without going into any sort of depth, but it might be something like, you have a character who, when she was small, lived in a family where, she had brothers and sisters who were quite feral, and at one point when some major thing happened, her sister came to her and was very kind to her and very loving and felt like she really knew her, and of course this character's like, oh my gosh, I'm finally heard that my sister knows me and loves me. And then her sister says, yeah, but and asks her to do something that would get her in trouble but would help the sister. And she's like, wait a minute, I get it. The nicer you are to me, the more you're just trying to use me. That's a way of the world. The nicer people are to you, the more they seem like they like you, the more actually what they're trying to do is to manipulate you into doing something that would go against your self-interest. Now, in that family, that's probably true. And that probably totally helped her. But out here in the real world, that's not true. Is it? I mean, I don't think it is. So this week, don't tell me if it's true. I don't want to know. I'm assuming that is not true. But you can see how something like that would lead someone astray, would keep them from getting what they want, especially if what they wanted was connection. So that would propel that character through their lives up until the moment where now a plot is created to force them to go after what they want, and in order to get it, they would have to overcome that misbelief. And everything in the plot is going to touch on that rail and force them to struggle internally. And that is what actually grips readers. It's what I like to call, and what gives meaning to what happens up here, I call it the third rail. It is the third rail in the story. It's where the electricity is. It's funny, when I was teaching this in Los Angeles at UCLA, a student raised her hand and she said, I think I understand what you mean about the third rail, but what are the other two rails? And I thought, oh yeah, you're not from New York. You have no clue what I'm talking about. But it is that rail where the electricity is, and everything. That, in fact, is what your narrative thread is. A story, one external problem grows, escalates, and complicates. It gets its power from the internal struggle it is forcing the protagonist to go through scene by scene by scene by scene as they fight to hold on to that misbelief. But slowly, life shows them that, in fact, it isn't so. That is what roots readers. That is what we come for. We do not come for the plot. We do not come for the plot because the plot is the surface world. And guess what? Each and every one of us, I think, has lived in the surface world from birth until now, and we all know how to do it. Like, you guys are great at it. From birth till now, you've survived, and you might not know this, but I've been secretly watching you from the beginning until now, and I think I can say with some authority that not one of you needs to read a book that's going to teach you how to sit in the surface world. You have that covered. You can check it off your list. But that's not what we want to know, is it? What we want to know is what's going on beneath the surface. That's what we come for. Think about it. I often think of story as the difference between what we say out loud and what we're really thinking when we say it. Because ask yourself, like in your life, how often is what you're saying to someone the same thing as what you're thinking in that moment? And which one is more interesting? And which one is juicier? And which one is more revealing? What you're thinking. And isn't that what you want to know from everyone else, from the barista in Starbucks on up? What are you thinking? How is this landing? Are you hearing what I'm really saying? Am I really understanding you? What is really going on beneath the surface? It's like when someone comes up to you and says, Matilda, I'll love you forever. What's your first thought after, my name's not Matilda? It's, really? Can I trust you? Will you still love me tomorrow? Are you punking me? This is what we come for. We come for what's beneath the surface. In life, we hear all the time, and I'm sure this is something you guys have heard, like from the time you're little up until now, you may have even heard it even this week, is, what do we hear? Never let him see you sweat, right? How many times have you heard that? Never let him see you sweat. What does that imply? That beneath the surface, we're sweating buckets that we're trying not to show. Story is about those buckets. I once had a student at UCLA who said, I know on the surface I look really put together. And she did. She said, I know on the surface I look really put together, but inside I'm a raging mess. And I'm trying to keep all of you from seeing it. Stories about that raging mess we all have on the inside. That's what makes writing so hard, because you have to be vulnerable and open up and let us know exactly what you think and what you're feeling and what matters to you. And that is really terrifying. But that's what we come for, those Me Too moments, so we can go, oh yeah, gosh, me too. I feel that way too. I do that too. I'm not the only one. Maybe it's not so bad. That is what makes writers able to let people into the things that otherwise they would not have any way of expressing, any way of knowing. That is what builds our communities. Now, let me give you an example. And I know you might think, okay, a minute ago you said there's no such thing as mindless entertainment. But I've also heard that there's an exception to every rule. So are you sure that this isn't that exception? And I don't think it is. So I promise you that after we go through this story, and it'll be a movie, because I use movies rather than books as examples, because more people have seen the same movie than have read the same book, and it's easier to kind of lift the spine out. Again, if it's a book, the one thing that books can do that films actually can't, I hate to say it because I know there are a lot of filmmakers, is that it can take us into that one place that even Mark Zuckerberg and all his minions have not yet been able to crack, and that is into what someone is thinking in the moment. That's what books do. So movies don't actually do that unless you have tons of voiceover, and then you've walked out after the first act anyway. But so I promise you that when we finished, I will tell you 3 profound things that in our cognitive unconscious we may be thinking when we leave the movie. Die Hard. The original, 1988. One of the best Christmas movies ever. If you watch holiday movies, this might be on your queue for next month. So Die Hard. What is the plot of Die Hard? What happens in Die Hard? Very quickly. Die Hard is about Bruce Willis. It's 1988, so we're picturing Bruce Willis with hair at this point. So Bruce Willis is John McClane. He's a New York City cop. He's married. His wife is quite successful. She gets a promotion, takes her out to Los Angeles. He does not want to go. He stays in New York. They haven't really broken up, but they're kind of estranged. They clearly still love each other. It's Christmas, and he is now going to visit her for the very first time. He gets to the big office building where her company is holding. It's empty except for, her company is holding the big Christmas party on the top floor. And when he gets there, he very soon thereafter discovers that pseudo-terrorists have taken over the building, and he basically has to kill all of them in order to save himself, his wife, and and whoever's left standing by the time the movie ends. Now, is that what Die Hard is about? Is Die Hard about the plot? Is Die Hard about whether good guy A, Bruce Willis, kills all of those bad guys? Would we even care about that just in general? It'd get boring really pretty fast. That is not what Die Hard is about. Some people will go, I know what Die Hard's about. Die Hard is about Bruce Willis saving his wife. And that is not what Die Hard is about either. He wants to save her for sure, but that's because what he really wants to do is he wants to win her back. He wants to win her back. He wants them to get back together. Now, of course, he wants to save her because he doesn't want to win her back in a body bag. That would be like a Pyrrhic victory if ever I heard one. But that's what he wants. That's what pushes him through. That is why we care. Okay, how do we know that? Where does this come from? We know it before the movie starts. Now, Roderick Thorpe, who wrote the book, I'm not sure who wrote the screenplay, but was really smart. Because when you're writing a story, you want to let us know what that story is going to be about immediately. So we, the viewer, already knows. We know immediately that these pseudo-terrorists, we don't know what they are yet, have taken over this building. But he doesn't know it. So we see that first. Now we meet him. And he's on a plane, and he's flying to LA, and then he's driving to the building. And so the question is, well, what does he want? Well, he wants to get his wife back. He makes that very clear. Okay, so what's this misbelief? What is holding him back? What does he need to overcome? And we actually hear it, in this car ride, and basically it goes to, okay, well, how did he lose her? So here's what happened. So again, this is the 80s, back when greed was good. So she has this job, and we don't actually know what it is. It seems to be in banking, and we know she's really good at it because she's got this gold watch, so clearly she's good. And she comes and she goes, come on, honey, I got this great job. We'll move out to LA. We'll take the kids. We'll have a much better life. P.S. I'm sure she was, making way more money than him. And he's like, no, I'm not going. Not going to do it. Why? Why didn't he want to go? Two reasons wrapped around. Again, a misbelief grows, escalates, and complicates. First, surface reason, very easy. Again, it was the 80s. Reason was, it was like, hey, I've got the rule book here, and the rule book says very clearly, we stay where the man's job is. And the last time I looked, I was the man. So I don't understand why we're even having this conversation. What's for dinner? So you can imagine that would not go over well. The other reason was that he wasn't John McClane, who happens to be a New York City cop. He was John McClane, New York City cop, one thing. And he was scared. Who was he going to be out in LA? It was terrifying. So he just wasn't going to go. What did he think was going to happen? Because this is what we always think in a story. What do we think is going to happen? What do you think is going to happen? So many of us have gone through this so much recently. What do you think is going to happen when we're faced with a big problem? What is the first thing that we do? We go to sleep and think maybe it'll be gone in the morning. And of course, by that time, it's had 8 hours to get worse. So what did he think was going to happen? He thought, and he says it, or Argyle says it, the driver, and he goes, yeah, that's what I thought. He thought she would either bomb out on her job or miss him so much, or both, and then she'd come back, and they would, he'd take her back, and he'd never say, I told you so. He'd be, big guy, and everything would go back to normal. And in literature as in life, nothing ever goes back to normal. You can't put your foot in the same river twice. So that's why they needed a plot that was going to force him to have to deal with this issue. And that's how things built, because without the plot, that plot could have been anything. Imagine what that movie would have been like, taking that premise, like if Woody Allen had made it, or if, some Antonioni had made it. Totally different plot. But, they wanted this thriller plot. But what would have happened even before he knew, if all those bad guys had not been there? And you actually find that out too, because you need that to happen. You need there to be that kind of conflict. You see, again, we know what's going on. He still doesn't know, and he gets to LA, and he sees her for the first time, and they, reunite, and we already know they both want to get back together. That is not an issue. And they kind of, they kiss, and it's wonderful. And then he says something snide, and she gets pissed off, and she storms out. Now, without a plot, what would have happened? Because why do we ever change? Do we ever change just because we decide to? We change because something forces us to. So had there been no plot, what would have happened is he would have stayed in, I love he calls it Ramona. He would have stayed in Pomona, which is way far. She had to be living in West LA or Santa Monica or somewhere. So he maybe would have seen her once or twice. They probably would have bickered all the way through. He would have gone back to New York, and he would have thought, I'm going to solve this problem later, or tomorrow, or when I'm rested, or when Mercury's out of retrograde, which would have translated on the calendar to a week from never. And now fast forward to, God, is it real? It's like 28 years later. That was 1988. 28 years later, and now we can picture Bruce Willis without hair, sitting in some dive bar in Port Authority, sobbing about how horrible women are. But that's not what happened. because the plot kicked in and forced him to really deal with it. And that's why we care. We care because we see him thinking, oh my gosh, how could I have left her? She might die. She mattered to me. How could I let this ridiculous thing stop me from seeing her for who she was? And we watch it. That's why we care. That's why we're being, it's also very exciting, of course. That's what's pulling us forward until it gets to that place when we know, okay, he's made this change. And it's that place, you know, in movies often when they're going to have a happy ending, like when it gets to like the end of, or, you know, close to the end of that second act, we think all is lost. Or if you're watching a movie and it seems like it's going to have a sad ending, and you go, oh my gosh, it might have a happy ending, and you look at your watch and it's still 20 minutes, you go, yeah, someone's going to die. But in this case, it was I guess about 3/4 of the way through, and now he's talking, he's realized it now. So he's talking on the walkie to his cop buddy Al, because it's a really early bromance, right? So like he and Al now are like they're BFFs, and he says, Al, I got a bad feeling. I don't think I'm going to make it. When all this is over, I want you to find my wife. Don't ask me how. By then you'll know. And I want you to say, honey, you heard me say, I love you 1,000 times. You never heard me say, honey, I'm sorry. And he's crying, and Al's crying, and we're crying, and then, of course, they do kill all the bad guys, and they get back together, because it's just that kind of movie. But so the question is, okay, so what? Mindless entertainment, right? What do we actually get out of that? What do we learn from that? And I don't mean what we might walk out of the theater thinking about, because what we might think we learned is like how to rappel down a 50-story elevator shaft using your belt and a gun. Don't try that. I'm not advocating that. But the 3 things we learn are, first, for guys, it's like, wow, he thought he had to be this macho guy who kept his feelings in and could not show how much he cared about his wife, like that would make him weak. But look, he's showing it now. And for some weird reason, that's not making him weaker. That seems to make him stronger. That's really cool. Maybe I can be more open with my wife, with my girlfriend, with my significant other. And for women, it's, wow, maybe guys don't have to be macho. Maybe I could hang in a little bit longer. Maybe when we get home after we've seen this, things will be different. And for everybody, it's, wow, here was a guy who was really defined by his job. He was defined by his life. He was scared to leave it. He has now realized that, as they say, wherever you go, there you are. And leaving that behind, maybe it wasn't working. Maybe that comfort zone wasn't great. Maybe coming over here to LA, maybe it might even have been better for him. Maybe I can let go of that thing that I thought defined me and take a chance. Maybe I can go and knock on the door of that cute devil down the street. Maybe I can leave this job and start a new job. Maybe I can start writing that novel or that screenplay that I want to. Because that's what will give you power. Because that's how people are changed, and that's how we are changed. Because when we're grabbed by a story, we don't have a choice. You've probably heard that saying, I think it's Coleridge who said, to get lost in a story demands a willing suspension of disbelief. Could not be more true, because it implies we have a choice, and we don't. When a story grabs you, you are helpless against it. Your biology puts a time out, and you are lost in the world of the story, experiencing what those characters are experiencing, and you see the world differently when you come out the other end. And here's the really scary thought. Writers often balk at this. They don't want to think about it. They want to just let their creativity out and let their art come out. You know who knows this? Advertisers, televangelists, politicians. They know this. That's how powerful story is. That's the power that you have. So my advice is, when you're pulled into a story afterwards, just run it through your conscious brain to be sure that you really do agree with those changes in the way that you might be seeing the world. And when you're writing a story, because you have this power, use that power wisely. And that is it. So do we want questions, or you tell me?
Well, again, thank you, Lisa. Now is going to be a great time for Q&A.
Hi, could you give one or two exceptions, like stories we might all know, classics like the Odyssey or Hamlet or something like that? Could you give one or two examples from stories we all might know, classics, maybe like the Odyssey or Hamlet, how this works?
It's so funny. That's the one thing I said to Nathan. I cannot, only because my brain doesn't work that way. Had I had it planned out, I totally could. The reason I use things that are super familiar like that is because they are laid so deeply in that even though I never read the Odyssey, so I absolutely can't do it for that at all. Hamlet I saw recently, but I no, I cannot.
Excuse me.
Not on the spur of the moment. I could if I sat down and read it, but not on the spur of the moment.
You would think that they do, even if you can't explain it. You would assume that they do.
I know that they do. I mean, I know that when you're pulled in, they absolutely do. I mean, that is what we're pulled into. We're not pulled. Story isn't about the what happens. Story is about the why and why it matters to someone. And with something like Hamlet, and that is the cheat of using a movie, because you don't have that internality that's actually there in a novel, which is usually what I'm talking about most. But again, stories about the why. Why does it matter to someone? Why are they doing what they're doing? Because that's what we want to know in life. We don't want to know that someone does something. We want to know why, because the why is often so different than what it appears to be on the surface. So, with Hamlet, if I stopped and thought about it, I wish my brain worked that way, because I now feel like, oh my God, no. But that's the one thing I always say when I speak. I can't pull it out that quickly. But thanks for the question.
Hi, how would you describe this process for like a memoir or autobiography? How is it similar or different?
It's exactly the same. Story is story, regardless the format, regardless the genre. So when you're writing a memoir, it is exactly that. I mean, the thing to keep in mind always is that we come to story, especially memoir, which can be hard because you've lived all of it. So a lot of the stuff that you're feeling, you're seeing in the words, and it's not necessarily on the page. But story is about how, if it's, say, your memoir, for instance, and I know nothing about this, I'm going to totally make it up, but you would find that one difficult thing that you went through, and it's not just about going through something difficult, but it's about how you changed during that. That is what the story is, and stories are about how we change internally, the sense that we're making of what's happening up here on the surface. I'll tell you an interesting story. It doesn't quite go to memoir, but that's how emotion gets on the page. It doesn't get on the page by who's happy, who's sad, his heart was pounding, his blood ran cold, but in how they're making sense of something with a tough decision that they need to make in every scene. The difficult part about writing a memoir is finding the story within your story and then allowing yourself to be vulnerable enough to tell that story, because story is about change, and it's about going in and needing to make a change. So it's about being super vulnerable. So if we're not seeing what it's costing you on the inside, then we're not reading. And again, when we read, we're then relating it to our own lives, because we're looking for insight into what makes people tick. I love that great line in Citizen Kane, where the newsreel producer says in the beginning, nothing's more interesting than finding out what makes people tick, and that's what we're talking about. So memoirs have to be written as well as novels. There is no difference. They should read exactly the same as a novel would read, and it's great because you got a lot to choose from, and it's hard because you have so much to choose from. So.
So the same could be said if you were writing a biography, right?
Oh, 100%.
And I remember in your book, Wired for Story, you said that, be careful with expository writing and only use what is relevant to the points that you were making about the plot,
absolutely.
the protagonist.
When we read, our assumption when we read is that everything in a story is there on a need-to-know basis. If we didn't need to know it, the author wouldn't bother to tell us. So that not only is everything there on a need-to-know basis, but it's there in terms of this internal struggle. And the problem when writers put in things that we don't need to know is that because we assume that we do, we'll start making up a reason for it. And if there's no reason for it to be there, our reason is inherently going to be wrong. And now we're reading a completely different story than the one that actually is meant to be on the page. And very soon things, stop making sense. And that's where people go astray. But everything, conclusion is drawn. Even, in descriptions, people will take time and they'll describe a room because that's what it looks like. And it's like, yeah, who cares? You want to describe it because some character there, especially if you're writing about someone or a novel or a memoir, you're writing in the first person, they're pulling some sort of strategic intel about that goes toward them, whether or not they're going to achieve their agenda or not. Because in a story, every character has one overarching agenda that begins on the first page and ends on the last, and that's what drives what they do in every single scene. Without that, it's just that bunch of things that happen. And that's what we're following, that internal struggle is what creates that sense of urgency and makes us want to know what happens next, not because it's just something that's going to happen, but because of the way it's going to affect the protagonist or whatever character it is in pursuit of this thing that they want. But we need to know what that is and what it means to them. And I could talk about this for all day, and I write about it, so it's kind of hard to pull it out that way. But yeah, it's exactly the same in a biography. And it's the same, and you want to let us know what that story is about right there on that very first page. Where are we going? What's his journey? What's it going to be about? Line or two. There's a great novel out now that I use as an example a lot called, it's by Celeste Ning. It's a literary novel. It's called Everything I Never Told You. And it opens, the first two lines it opens with are, Lydia is dead, they don't know it yet. Lydia is the middle child, almost 16-year-old child, or that's as old as she's going to get, of a family of 5, now 4, and the entire novel is about how her death came to be, what happened to her. That's what we want to know. Well, what happened to her and why? But that arc and that one overarching problem that everybody is dealing with is both what happened to her, how it affects them, and then who they were and how they came together to create the situation that created who Lydia was and made what happened happen. But it's all tied to that idea of what happened to her and how are these people going to deal with that death. So we get it right there. We understand what that's going to be. And the same would be true in a biography too. Kind of where are we going, or why. Can I give you one other example? Because we were talking about this today, about kind of what you're going for on that level. We did this live Q&A today. I teach an online class of this, and my co-teacher was talking about the show that everybody's watching now, The Queen, right? And so we're watching The Queen, and we know what happened. We know exactly that she became queen when she's young, and she's still queen. So we know where that's going. And she married Philip, and she's marrying him in that, in the opening show episode, she's marrying him, and she's still married to him. So we know what happens, but we don't come for what happens. We come for why and how it affected them and how that marriage took place and what it cost them and what it meant for him to have to bow down to her and how the world changed as a result. That's what we're looking for, is that internal, not just the big external picture of what happened, but why and what it meant to those people. Because even though, and that is the great thing, you watch a show like that, and it's like, okay, I hate to break it to all of you, but none of us are going to be the Queen of England, I don't think. I think that job is like, we're just not up for that. But we might be in a relationship where what's happening there is relevant to our own relationship. And that's what we do. We look at what's going on in her life and what happened with her, and we immediately relate it to our own marriage, our own life, our own way that we see things. It's that Me Too moment. But it only comes from something as specific as, as that. So I don't know if that helps. And I got a bit off track, but yeah.
I have a question about characters who it's not obvious to me how they change, but the stories are still compelling. So 2 examples I can think of. I'm not sure if you're familiar with the movie Memento, one of Christopher Nolan's early ones, where the character I don't think stays pretty constant throughout, but there's obviously a big reveal at the end. And another maybe example is The Sixth Sense, with the character who's, I don't know that they change so much, but obviously it's a very compelling story.
I saw Memento a long time ago, so I couldn't. If I saw it, I'm sure I could pull in and do that. The Sixth Sense, I think, is a terrible movie, and I'll tell you why. I will tell you why. The reason is it's a fake, and I'll tell you why. Because the scenes that they pick to show to intimate that he does not know that he's dead, are all scenes in which we, the people watching, could see that he's being fooled. He's sitting there and it seems like he's talking to her or he's not. Or he walks in and there's a legitimate reason why whoever he's having that dinner with his wife, as I recall, and she's like silent and he's talking and she's not paying attention. And in that situation, given what's happened, you believe that. But he's a character who lives 24/7. So you got to know that the first time he walked into a store and tried to buy a pack of gum and no one could see him, he would think, something weird's going on here. I think I might be dead. It's just so ridiculous. What that interchange was and him letting go of his wife, I would have to go back and watch. The trouble with this, and it's funny, Jenny and I were talking about this today, is that yes, I could pull all of this. If we sat and watched it together, we could pull it all apart. But it is deeply embedded in movies and more so in novels. It's actually easier to see it and to pull it out in novels because novels take what sometimes in movies where we're watching a movie and we get the body language and we can see it and we understand what that means. It's very difficult to describe body language compellingly in a novel in the same way it is when we're actually seeing it and feeling it on that level. In a novel, you really are in someone's head, and you really can go, oh, aha, here's the aha moment. Oh, aha, here are the layers of the story. Here's how the character's making sense. It's on the page. Start looking for it. You'll see it. In the novels that you read, you will see that this internal thought is on every page. It's not in italics, it's not in quotes. It's the way the character is making sense of what's happening and the way they're describing or thinking about even, the description of a podium or the description of, whatever it would be. They're making sense of it based on who they are, what matters to them, and what their agenda is, because that's what we all do every single day. Each one of you, we're all sitting in the same room. The same thing is happening right now to each and every one of us. But if each of us went home and wrote what it meant and what happened to us, we might read stuff and go, oh my God, it doesn't sound like they're even in the same country, let alone in the same room, because each one of us is taking a different meaning from what we see. That's what story does, and that's what we get down into when we're reading, and that's what's on the page, and that change comes from, again, a change in how the protagonist is perceiving the world and what matters to them. It's like there's what's that great T.S. Eliot quote? I think it's at the end of our journey will be to arrive at where we started and to know the place for the first time. And that's what story is. It's about how the plot forces the protagonist to come back to that moment in the beginning and have that realization that changes everything. And we track that all the way through. Again, the hardest thing about it is talking about it here in general. It's way easier, to go into the specifics of it when we're talking about someone's specific story. But that's where it is, and if you start looking for it, you'll see when we talk about those origin scenes, the place where that misbelief is born. If you want to talk about a movie, if you want to think about the King's Speech, we see that moment when I think it's the nanny or whatever is kind of pinching him, and he starts to sob, and his father yells at him, and okay, that's it. And an odd historical note is that apparently that did happen, except it happened to the other brother. They reversed it, which is okay, don't know what that means. But that would be that moment where that came into birth. In a novel, you'd go much more deeply into that. In a film, that would be an example. But if you start watching it, like we teach this class, and people go on and go, oh my God, I just watched so-and-so, and that's where that origin scene was, or that's where the misbelief came from. So if you start looking for it, I think you'll see it. And if you don't, you can write me and yell at me. I'm totally fine with that. I don't know what you're talking about. Totally fine.
Hi.
Hi.
When people talk about the stakes aren't high enough, is that really just, I feel like you're saying we don't really know how the person's feeling enough?
I think often it's that. I mean, I think there's so many reasons for that, but often, it's like something big is happening, but they're not really reacting to it. It doesn't really matter to them. Birth, death, fall of the Roman Empire, it's neutral. If it's not affecting someone, and again, not affecting them in general, but affecting them in terms of this agenda that they entered with, and is it or isn't it helping them? And also, writers have a hard time doing what they really need to do, which is being super mean to their protagonist. and really putting them through hell, because in life we want to be nice, and in life it's shocking how writers will do that all the time. Like they'll have, and it's like, and now this horrible thing happened, but they're getting along and it's really fun, and isn't that good? And in life, okay, yeah, maybe. In a story, not so much. You're always looking for where that, that problem is. You're always looking for, my advice always is, how could you make it worse? How could it be worse? What is that thing they don't want to happen? How can you make that happen? But yeah, the stakes need to rise. And the way the stakes often rise is that, again, we tend to do as little as possible to solve the problem, and everything we do to make it better only makes it worse. And that's how stakes rise. That's why I don't believe in that external story structure, 3 acts or whatever. I think story structure is the byproduct of a story well told. Because when we're resisting, we're making mistakes. When we want our cake and eat it too. We want that thing that we want, but we also want to hold on to that misbelief. And so we're misreading people all the way through. But be mean to your protagonist. Be really mean to them. Not just mean to them like hitting them, but be mean to them where it really hurts. Embarrass them. Mortify them. That's way worse than just hitting them on the head with a hammer. So, yeah, and then they raise in every scene. I mean, but that is the other thing, that people will write things and there isn't that ticking clock. They don't have an external one problem that grows, escalates, and complicates that actually does grow, escalate, and complicate, and grows, escalates, and complicates while forcing them to deal with this inner issue that they've got, this misbelief. Because often, big bad things happen up there, but because it doesn't have a real consequence, it doesn't feel like the stakes are high. Does that make sense? I could talk forever about that. It's a good question.
Any other questions? Okay, cool.
Hi.
Hey.
So if we read stories and are drawn in to gain insight or learn how to deal with a new problem or situation, why is it we can enjoy the same story over and over again?
That's a really good question, and I think it's because the same way we can enjoy eating I think 2 things. One, it's the same way, just because you had a hot fudge sundae once doesn't mean you don't want it again. In fact, often you want it like way more than that. I think also because the feelings, like I watch It's a Wonderful Life every year. I watch West Side Story over and over and over. I listen to songs over and over because they take me on that journey again, because they make me feel that same way again, and because I'm so pulled into it. And sometimes, don't you find sometimes you see things you didn't see before? I mean, I find that, especially seeing something the second time, because things are set up really well. You don't really realize they're set up well because you don't know exactly where it's going or what's going to happen. But once you see it the second time, it's like, oh my God, they have that there and that there, and I didn't even realize it. So the second time can sometimes be even more, more moving than the first. But I think it's because it just takes us through that same journey again. It especially if it's something that we really like, it reinforces that people. I watched, It's a Wonderful Life. It reinforces that people are good. I cry at the end every time. Because maybe good things can happen, and that's a much darker movie than you'd think, because he might go to jail. Nobody got the money back. Nobody, and those people don't know he didn't embezzle the money. He might have. Who knows? They don't know it, but they trusted in him, and that is such a good feeling. So I think that's why, and I think also because we change a lot. Sometimes even if you read the same thing again, if you've changed, it might change you in a different way because you're seeing things differently now too, because I think we're constantly, changing on that level. It just feels good. I think is the answer. It just feels good. Or if we're depressed, we want to feel bad. We want to go, yeah, that truth is still there. But I know what you mean.
Anyone else have a question or two?
Yes.
And that you mean more than hit them on the head.
Yes.
Could you expand on that or give a second wonderful piece of advice? To a guy writing a story, doesn't quite gel, bad things are happening, something's missing.
Well, what's usually missing is what I'm talking about, which is, again, story being one problem that grows, escalates, and complicates. But the problem doesn't just start on page 1. It started long before that. Same thing with that internal struggle. Started long before that. as Nathan knows, I love to redefine terms. Like, we won't go into all of them. But one I really like to redefine and get out of the pejorative way that people think of it is backstory. Backstory is the most fundamental layer of any story. As Faulkner said, the past isn't dead, it isn't even past. And so if things aren't working, it's because it isn't that one thing that's growing, escalating, and complicating. And so suddenly you're not sure what it's about or what happens next. And then the way writing is taught is we'll throw some exciting thing in, or throw some other emotion in, or throw something else in from the outside to jazz it up. And what that really does is, story being a cause and effect trajectory, even if there is a cause and effect, it's now like you've thrown a bomb in what you've got, and it's obliterated it because we look for that cause and effect.
It sounds a little bit like the way I'm hearing it, that if you have your lead character, or any of the characters,
Right.
they don't always, to use your language, even know what their misbelief is.
A lot of times they don't. But here's the thing.
And just,
Yes,
if I
I'm
may-
sorry.
No, but it's
Go ahead. Very true.
many times, not many times, but sometimes in movies we say corny. They always, not always,
Right.
something like, well, when he was 5 years old, he was bitten by the dog, and there
Right.
is the origin. And we don't want to do that.
No,
So
we do not.
that's all I got.
Yeah, no, I think that's a really good point. Often, of course, not only don't they, sometimes they don't even know it, and sometimes, you know, and obviously they don't think it's a misbelief, they think it's true. Sometimes they don't know what they want. Think about rom-coms. You know, almost always it's like the protagonist goes in thinking they want one thing, and the whole story is about how they discover they want something else. But the thing as a writer is, you have to know what those things are before you get to page one. You can't write forward without it, because otherwise, how can you write a story that forces them to change? And it's sort of like when you go to a therapist and you tell them all the stuff about your life. And then they go, wait, here's what I think you're really saying and what you want. And they're like dead on right. And you didn't know it. But because it was what you wanted, you were exhibiting behavior and saying things that let that therapist know. That lets the readers know. That's why you have to know going in.
Okay, bigger problem.
Okay.
Forget the character doesn't know.
Forget-
What if the writer doesn't know?
The writer has to know. That's
All
the
right,
problem.
well, duh. What
That's
if
the
he
problem.
doesn't? How does he figure it out? She even.
No, women don't figure. You really go. I mean, I actually wrote a whole book. My book, Story Genius, is about exactly that. But you do have to go out and figure it out. It's hard. That is the hardest thing about writing, and that is the hardest part of it in the beginning, because you're creating something out of nothing, and that is super hard. But I'll give you one very quick piece of advice. The first thing to ask yourself is, what's your point? All stories make a point beginning on page one. What's your point? What matters to you? What are you saying about human nature? What is that inside intel you're going to give us? Why does that matter to you? And diving into that, and most people have some idea of what the direction the plot's going to go in, because that's what we usually get first. You can then pull that back. What's that point? What is it you're telling us? Because a point, again, as Nathan knows, another word I don't like, theme, you know, but it's not theme, it's like, what is it that you're telling us about human nature? What inside intel, how do you want to change us by the end of the book? You know, what is that aha moment that character is going to have, or not, depending on what you're writing, that's going to make us go, oh my God, I'm enlightened now by how people see things, and that changes how I see things, because I have more insight now. What is that change you want to make? Why does that matter to you? And the reason figuring out why it matters to you really matters is for exactly what we're talking about now. Writing is hard, and it takes anyone who tells you writing a novel or writing is easy is lying to you and probably trying to sell you something. It is really hard. So just last thing I promise. The more you know why it's important to you, the more you'll be able to keep writing during those times when that voice says, this is really stupid, I hate this, no one's going to like it, what's wrong with me, I should go get a snack, it'll keep you at it. Okay, now I'm done. How?
How does the writer figure it out?
Well, I would think they started with that. Do you know what your point is? Do you know what that is? Do you know what you want to say? I mean, if you don't have anything to say, then maybe you don't have anything to write. But if you do, you start and specifics beget specifics.
As a writer, sometimes, to the feeble extent that I am a writer, I was just trying to write this story.
Right.
Okay? I didn't know I had to have a point.
All stories have a point. All stories have a point. Begins on page 1. Uh-oh. Yeah.
TV, movies, there's a lot of bad.
There is a lot of bad. No, believe me, I am totally with you on that. There is. But all stories really do make a point beginning on that first page. That's where they're going. That's how you write something that actually gets to that point. And the way the point is made is the aha moment, that your character has or doesn't have at the end. And the same way if you were like in school, right? And someone said, okay, you've had this history class and now you're writing, a paper, and you go, okay, I've just studied Bulgaria. I'll throw everything I know about Bulgaria onto the page and then we'll see. It's like no one would read that because who cares? Instead, you go, okay, there's this interesting thing about Bulgaria that's fascinating, and I'm going to write a paper that makes that point. Because that's what pulls us in and makes us curious. And we're smart on that level. Our brains were wired to want to make sense of things, to look for that cause and effect. They say that, what is it they say? This is so glib, but it's like we can go 40 days without food and 3 days without water and 35 seconds without trying to make meaning in something. But we make meaning in something because that's how we survive. What does this mean? Is it going to help me? Is it going to hurt me? And so when we're reading a story, we're looking for that cause and effect, which leads to a point, which leads to where it's going. Otherwise, it just ends up being a bunch of things that happen. And I have to tell you, most manuscripts that come in are that, like honestly. So you're not alone. You have tons of company.
So to answer the question of how do you do this, Lisa's trying hard not to promote something that you should buy of hers, but one of the books that she wrote is called Story Genius, and I have the book, and I am taking Lisa's Story Genius workshop, and I'm finding it extremely helpful to specifically give instructions on how to do this. So I recommend Story Genius, the book, and her writing workshop for the step-by-step process for how to figure out what your point is, how to figure out what your protagonist's misbelief is, how to match that up with your plot, and how to write a compelling story.
Oh, thanks. Oh. Thanks, you guys.
All right. Well, I guess with that, I want to thank you all for coming so much. And again, thank you, Lisa, for this evening. A big round of applause.